Welcome back. Now that we've covered all of our methods of primary data collection and analysis, it's time to talk about putting it all together into a report. And if you somehow found these videos through YouTube, my name is Sean Jordan. I'm a professional marketing researcher, and this is the first part of our sixth lecture series for a class on qualitative research for marketing researchers at the SIUE Master of Marketing Research program. Now, in our previous lecture series, we talked about how qualitative research is like a light in the darkness, helping to define and make sense of the shapes and shadows that we see off in the distance. We also talked about how there are four basic applications of qualitative research, which are exploration, deep dives, or drill downs, idea generation, and testing. We've covered four qualitative methods: observational research, individual in-depth interviewing, ethnography, and focus groups. And we've talked about qualitative data analysis and categorization and coding, both in an abstract manner and with some how-to videos looking at providing different techniques. Now, in this series, we're going to discuss putting it all together into a qualitative report. And I want to be clear in saying that my perspective on reporting is not reflective of all perspectives out there, because as with qualitative data analysis, there's really no consistent style on which qualitative researchers present their findings. On the quantitative side of research, there's been a major shift over the last 20 years away from written document-style reports into something that's a little bit more visual, like slide decks or infographics or dashboards. But on the qualitative side, reporting data in such a condensed fashion generally takes away a lot of the oomph from the actual research. And the result can be that your audience is distrustful of your findings because they haven't had time to fully review your data. As research practitioners, we often talk about how there's both an art and a science to good research. The science involves our method and how we collect and analyze our data, but the art is often in how we present those data to others. I often tell my own research team that our job in preparing a report is to become data curators who are expert in everything that we have to offer, and who can present the most important and meaningful findings we have, along with our best supporting data, so that our research audience can truly understand what we learned from our fieldwork in support of the purpose and objectives of the study. One way for you to think about this would be to consider an art museum exhibit that is presenting a collection of work from a famous artist. The art museum isn't just going to set up a bunch of sculptures and hang a bunch of pictures on the walls. They're going to build an exhibit that has a flow to it, and then they're going to consider where similar pieces might go well together, and they might also consider where visitors might need more time to examine a particularly notable piece or group of pieces in that collection. The art museum might not provide a lot of information on every piece, but they probably will include some displays to try to put certain pieces in their proper historical context. They might even explain what the artist was trying to accomplish or how the work was related to other artistic movements or other artists of the day. They might even think about including, towards the end of the exhibit, a summary of what was shared or some takeaways from the experience. And, of course, being an art gallery, they're probably also going to have a gift shop. Unfortunately for us, though, research projects tend not to have those. But of course, depending upon the size of the exhibit and the type of gallery in which it's being offered, how much depth or detail provided is going to vary. A small exhibit may only include a few important pieces. A larger exhibit may be more comprehensive and include other artifacts like notebooks, sketches, or artistic tools, as well as maybe even some details or history on the artist's environment or upbringing. A good research report functions much like an exhibit of a famous artist's work. A conventional report tends to be a comprehensive look at all the data collected, and it needs to be carefully arranged to ensure that the research audience is able to make sense of what's being shared. Summary reports and visual display tools like top-line briefs, dashboards, infographics, and journey maps are much less comprehensive and instead focus on the findings and application of the data. And clip reels and videography videos function more like documentary films, taking the audience into the world of the participants to observe slivers of the actual fieldwork. Ultimately, the question that a qualitative researcher needs to ask him or herself in designing reporting tools, which, by the way, are often called deliverables in a marketing research project, are how much detail a research audience requires and what sort of format makes the most sense for presenting that detail. We'll talk a little bit more about the types of audiences in our next lecture, but let's first focus on the question of the best way in which we should present our data. That involves thinking a bit about the difference between what we have to say and what we want to share. If the data provide our subject, our method is our style, and our words are our paints, and our analytics are our tools, then our report is the final combination of those elements into something that our audience can truly appreciate. We don't want to hand them a mess of shapes and colors that don't mean anything to them. We want to provide a representation that not only gets our meaning across, but aids in their understanding of the subject in a manner that goes beyond their own ability to just read the raw data and try to create their own understanding from what's there. One of the most important aspects of qualitative reporting, however, involves staying true to the data. And this is an area where many qualitative researchers can actually get themselves into trouble, because what they may do is present their own opinions and then support them with cherry-picked data rather than present a set of interpretations that are based solely upon the data. I remember early on in my career, we at my firm were trying to find new ways to share our qualitative data with clients. We were asked to make a presentation to a board, and this was a high context meeting, and the client decided that they wanted to see what we were going to present before we shared it with the board, so they had us fly in early to do a practice presentation for them. My job was to present the data, which that part went fine. They had no problems with the data. But then my partner, who was a lot older than me, was supposed to stand up and provide some interpretation of that data. So kind of bring the wisdom to the young guy that was presenting the data. And he really got into it, and he developed a passionate, podium-pounding speech. And I thought it was pretty good, personally, but as we were practicing, my client interrupted him and said, "Where are you getting this from?" And they explained that they hadn't hired us to be consultants. They'd hired us to conduct and present research. They didn't want us to go beyond what we had to say from the data because they didn't feel like our opinions were valuable or valid, which was kind of alarming to hear, but that was how they felt. We actually wound up in that practice session having to spend about 15 to 20 minutes showing how the data backed up what we were saying by citing specific quotes. And the client ultimately asked us to just share the quotes and then leave out our interpretation. Just kind of tie it together, but let the quotes speak for themselves. That was eye-opening to us both, and we learned from that to be careful not to stray too far from the data and to always lay foundation with examples of our data before we made statements that might be challenged. Another advantage of actually sharing your data rather than your interpretation of it is that you can help to capture some of the flavor and the context of what was ultimately said. I find this is particularly helpful in high context studies like business to business or expert users, because a lot of times we hear things that we don't entirely understand as researchers, but we'll to the client when we share those quotes and then affirm that we really did talk to real people who understand them and their processes. Sometimes participants have really interesting ways of saying things too, or providing a powerful, well thought out and simple statement. We can use direct quotes to create what are called in vivo codes or categories to establish our broader themes within the data. But we can also use quotes to punctuate our own interpretation by showing how what we're reporting is supported directly by what we learned from our research. This tends to have a very positive impact on research audiences and makes them trust the data analysis more willingly. There are many different ways of reporting qualitative data, and we'll actually cover the methods of presenting data later on in this series, but often clients or end users want to have some sort of written or visual deliverable that they can review and utilize. And there are several different formats that you can use depending upon the amount of detail required. One of those is the top-line report or brief. And this is usually something that is very summarized and has a low amount of detail, and often presented in either a written document or some kind of slide deck or even a detailed email that provides highlights of the research. And it's usually just a couple of pages or a few pages. It doesn't go into a lot of depth and detail. It may include some quotes, but it may also not. And it might even just be impressions from the research team of what was learned. This is usually something that is more preliminary or something that is done where there's a small amount of research that's been conducted, maybe in a pilot study or an initial focus group or a handful of interviews or something like that. And it's used to shorten the amount of time required to get a report to the client. Another tool that is used, which can take a little bit longer to produce, might be an infographic, a dashboard, some persona profiles, or journey maps. And again, these tend to have a low amount of detail, and we're going to talk about some of these visualization tools later on in this series. But what's nice about them is that they're often focused on the conclusions rather than the data, and because they're visual, they're a little bit easier for a non-research audience to look at and grasp the meaning of. Now, again, these might not have a lot of detail, but they can take a long time to produce depending on the complexity of them and what you're trying to accomplish. So I don't want to suggest that that low amount of detail means that they're easy to make. It's actually a lot easier to write up a report sometimes than it is to create some of these visualizations. Something else that tends to be very popular is, especially if you've done observed or recorded interviews or focus groups, is to have a clip reel or a videography reel that showcases some of the qualitative field work and includes thematic quotes and perhaps even nonverbal data. Now, the thing about these types of methods is that production values can vary, and depending on where you did your focus group or your interviews, you may not have great quality video or sound, and so they're not always the best deliverable. These are also really great for ethnography, by the way, especially if you can have a professional video crew there to really capture great film and great sound. But the limitation of these, they take a long time to produce. They can be expensive to produce too. And a lot of times they showcase the data, but they don't necessarily provide a good interpretation of it. So they're not a great replacement for other types of reporting. They usually are more of an augmentation. Something else that you can share is a report deck, where you build a slide deck or document that covers the key research findings in a visual format with some detailed data included, but not all of it. I tend to use these for presentations. I do not tend to use these for reports because I don't think they generally go into enough depth and detail in a qualitative study to really arm the client with enough information about what we learned. They're great for a summary, but they are not great as a report. But sometimes they're a good substitution. If a client doesn't have time to read a full report, you can give them a presentation deck and they can review that. However, I tend to lean towards these other two methods as being a lot more reliable. One of those is to write an article or a paper, which is something that I don't do as much because I'm not an academic and I'm not publishing my work. But that's where you take your key findings and you summarize your complete insights, often presenting literature review and theoretical implications as part of what you've written up. And that can be really useful because it adds some kind of mystique and some credibility to your work because you managed to get it published or put it into a paper somewhere. So that can make it seem a lot more meaningful. But it's generally something that you're going to do more for public consumption than you're going to do for a for-hire project for a client like you might as a marketing researcher. What you're typically going to do as a marketing researcher is instead put together a written report that contains all of your data, a high level of detail, and it's going to generally be segmented into two pieces. One is going to be your key findings or your detailed findings that talk about the big picture things that you've learned and the insights and the synthesis that emerged from your data analysis. And then you're also going to have a much more detailed findings section or an appendix that has all of the data that you collected. And when you present that, it's generally going to be something that's more of as a reference tool than it is something that you're intending for your audience to read through. And it might even have coding and categorization and things in there that are not easy for a non-research audience to read, but which are there for reference in case any questions come up. Well, we are just getting started in our discussion on reporting and presenting. And in our next lecture, I'm going to offer some good general guidelines for ensuring that your qualitative reports reach the right audience and don't trigger a lot of skepticism.